The untold story behind their relationship. There is a photograph. You may have seen it. Two people standing close together at an industry event, not touching, not posing, not performing for the camera. Just existing near each other with the kind of effortless comfort that takes years to build. Both of them are smiling, but not at the camera. At something between them. Something private. Something that existed only in that specific moment, in that specific space between two people who had quietly become each other's entire world. That photograph was taken in 2016. By 2020, those two people had signed divorce papers. And in the years since, neither of them has ever fully explained what happened. This is the story of Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu. Not the version that entertainment magazines printed. Not the version that fan accounts constructed from red carpet appearances and Instagram posts. The real version. The one that lived behind all of that. The one that was always more complicated, more human, and more heartbreaking than anything the public was ever allowed to see. And the reason this story matters today, years after it ended, is because it never really ended. Not in the way people think. Not in the clean, final way that the word divorce implies. There are threads from this relationship still visible in both of their careers, both of their public silences, and both of their recent interviews. If you know where to look. By the end of this video, you will know exactly where to look. Let us go back to the very beginning. Not when they met. Before that. Because to understand what this relationship was, you first have to understand who these two people were separately, and what each of them had already survived before they found each other. Barış Arduç was born in 1984 in Istanbul. He came into acting through a path that many Turkish actors of his generation share: theater training, small television roles, the slow grind of building a reputation in an industry that has very little patience for slow development. But Barış was not slow. He was precise. He had a quality that is genuinely difficult to teach, the ability to be completely still on screen and still hold all of the attention in the room. His early work showed flashes of something deeper than what the roles required of him, and the people paying close attention in the industry noticed. He was known before Karalık Aşk. He was respected before Karalık Aşk. But he was not yet a star in the way that word gets used when it means something has genuinely broken through into the culture. Elçin Sangu we have already traced. Born in 1985. Built her reputation through discipline and range. Medcezir had given her visibility. But the version of Elçin that the public fell completely in love with had not fully arrived yet. And then Karalık Aşk put them in the same room. The series began production in 2015. The premise was built around a central romantic tension between two characters who should not work together but are pulled toward each other by something neither of them can fully explain or resist. On paper it was a formula that Turkish television had used dozens of times. The details change. The chemistry either exists or it does not. Almost nobody expected what the chemistry between Barış and Elçin would actually produce. People who were on set during the early weeks of production have described something that is almost impossible to manufacture artificially. An ease. A naturalness. A sense that the two of them had already worked out a private language that the cameras were simply being allowed to observe. Directors noted that scenes that normally require multiple takes to achieve the right emotional register were happening in one or two. Not because they were technically perfect but because something true was coming through the performances that technical perfection alone cannot produce. The audience felt it immediately. Within weeks of the show airing, online communities dedicated entirely to Barış and Elçin, as characters and increasingly as real people, began forming spontaneously across multiple platforms. By the time the first season ended, the two of them had become something that Turkish entertainment rarely produces and that the industry still struggles to fully understand. They had become a phenomenon that existed simultaneously as fiction and as reality in the public imagination. Because rumors had already started. And the rumors were not wrong. What exactly happened between them during the filming of Karalık Aşk is something that belongs to them and only to them. But what is publicly documented is the timeline. They began appearing together publicly in ways that moved beyond professional obligation. Their social media presence began to quietly shift. The careful professional distance that actors typically maintain, especially in Turkish entertainment where the cultural stakes of perceived romantic involvement are high, began to dissolve. By 2016 they were openly together. The public reaction to this confirmation was extraordinary. Not simply excited or celebratory, which would have been expected, but almost emotionally relieved. As if a large number of people had been holding their breath waiting for something they already felt to be confirmed. Fan communities across Turkey and across the Turkish diaspora globally responded with a level of emotional investment that their management teams, their production company, and arguably Barış and Elçin themselves had not fully anticipated. This is the first complication in this story. And it is an important one. When a relationship becomes public property to the degree that theirs did, something shifts in the internal experience of that relationship. The two people at the center of it are no longer simply two people in love. They are a symbol. They carry the emotional investment of millions of people who have grafted their own desires and hopes and romantic ideals onto what they are watching. That weight is real. It presses on the relationship from the outside in ways that are genuinely difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. Barış and Elçin handled the public attention with considerable grace. They were visible enough to not seem secretive, which the press would have found suspicious and intrusive. They were private enough to maintain real boundaries. They appeared at events together. They gave interviews where they acknowledged each other warmly without turning their relationship into content for public consumption. It was a genuinely difficult balance, and they maintained it with an elegance that their colleagues in the industry noted and respected. But underneath that elegance, according to people close to both of them who have spoken carefully and indirectly about this period over the years, things were more complicated. The pressure of Karalık Aşk was immense. The show was not simply a job. It was an ongoing, constantly observed, publicly discussed event. Every episode was analyzed. Every scene between them was dissected. Every real-world interaction between Barış and Elçin was filtered through the lens of their characters and used to construct narratives that had nothing to do with their actual relationship but were impossible to fully separate from it regardless. Imagine trying to build something real and private with another person while millions of people are simultaneously watching a fictionalized version of you building something real and private with that same person. The lines between performance and reality, between who you are for the camera and who you are at 2 in the morning when nobody is watching, those lines become genuinely difficult to locate. Sources close to the production have noted, and this is reported carefully as the accounts of people familiar with the situation rather than confirmed statements from either Barış or Elçin themselves, that there were periods during the later run of the show where the weight of public expectation was creating a pressure inside the relationship that was difficult to navigate. The show demanded a certain emotional performance from them both. Real life was demanding something different. Balancing those two realities simultaneously, with an audience of millions invested in one version and the private truth of the other, is not something any relationship training prepares you for. The show ended in 2017. And here is where the story takes its first unexpected turn. When long-running series that have built their audience around a central romantic pairing come to an end, there is typically a period of readjustment. The constant structure of production, the enforced proximity, the shared professional purpose, those things provide a scaffolding. When the scaffolding comes down, the relationship has to stand on its own in a way it perhaps has not fully been tested to do before. For Barış and Elçin, what followed was a period of relative quiet. They were still together. They were still appearing publicly together. The fan communities were still active and invested. But the quality of their public presence had shifted slightly. Less frequent. More guarded. Smaller in scale than the Karalık Aşk era had been. In 2018, they married. The announcement was quiet, which surprised some observers given the scale of public interest in them as a couple. There was no elaborate media moment. No staged reveal. Just a confirmed report of a private ceremony followed by a brief acknowledgement from both of them. which in retrospect, knowing what followed, feels significant. It was a marriage that began with a deliberate attempt to keep it away from the public machinery that had defined the relationship's early years. Whether that attempt succeeded privately, even if it appeared to succeed publicly, is something that only they know. What is publicly documented is that in 2020, 2 years after their marriage, they announced their separation and subsequent divorce. The announcement was again handled with exceptional care. No public statements that assigned blame. No interviews that offered grievances. No social media activity that could be read as commentary on the other person. They both, essentially, stepped back from the story of their relationship and allowed it to close without fanfare. The public reaction was enormous and immediate. The same communities that had celebrated their relationship with such intensity now responded with grief that was, in some cases, genuinely startling in its depth. There were people who had never met either Barış or Elçin who described feeling the news as a personal loss. Who felt, genuinely and not irrationally given how long they had been emotionally invested, that something they cared about had ended. This is one of the most underexamined aspects of what happened. The grief was real. It was widespread. And it was largely invisible to Barış and Elçin themselves, who were going through their own version of that grief privately while also managing their careers, their professional reputations, and the continued public attention that comes from being the people you are in Turkish entertainment. Neither of them disappeared. Neither of them retreated into silence for an extended period. Both of them continued working with the kind of professional commitment that people inside the industry describe as remarkable given the circumstances. They showed up. They were good. They did not make the ending of their marriage anyone else's problem. But here is the thing that those who have watched both of them carefully in the years since have noted. The way each of them works has changed. Not dramatically. Not in ways that make headlines on their own. But perceptibly, if you are paying attention. Barış Arduç's performances in the years following the divorce have carried something that several critics have described independently of each other using versions of the same word. Weight. A quality in his work that suggests access to emotional territory that his earlier performances, brilliant as they were, did not quite reach. Roles that require him to portray loss, or quiet devastation, or the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from loving something you could not hold on to, those roles have taken on a dimension in recent years that feels earned in the deepest sense of that word. Elçin Sangu's trajectory has been different but equally telling. Her increasing guardedness. Her more selective project choices. And then, most recently, the interview that went viral across the Turkish-speaking world and well beyond, where she spoke about the experience of losing herself inside the version of her that the public had built and maintained and needed her to be. She did not name the marriage. She did not name the divorce. She did not name Barış. But there are people who watched that interview, people who have followed both of their careers and their shared history for years, who feel absolutely certain that the cage she described was not built only by fame. That the experience of having a relationship simultaneously lived and publicly performed, of having your private love story become a cultural event that millions of people feel ownership over, contributed substantially to the kind of internal dislocation she was describing. Again, this is interpretation. It is what careful, long-term observers of both careers have suggested. It is not a confirmed statement from either of them. That distinction matters. But the interpretation has weight precisely because it is so consistent across so many independent sources. Now let us talk about something that almost nobody in the mainstream coverage of this story has addressed directly. What does it actually do to two people to have fallen in love partly inside a performance? Karalık Aşk was fiction. The characters they played were not them. But the feelings that developed between them during the filming of that show were real. And the experience of having those real feelings exist simultaneously with, and inevitably influenced by, the fictional version of those feelings being broadcast to millions of people every week, that is not a standard romantic experience. That is something genuinely unusual and genuinely complex. There is a psychological dimension to this that psychologists who study parasocial relationships and celebrity culture have discussed in general terms, though never specifically in relation to Barış and Elçin. The basic principle is this. When two people fall in love in a context that is simultaneously observed and performed, the experience of the relationship is always partly mediated by the awareness of being watched. Even in private moments. Even in moments that have nothing to do with the cameras. Because the cameras have created a frame, and once a frame exists, it is very difficult to stop seeing yourself inside it. The question of how much that awareness affected the relationship is unanswerable from the outside. But it is not irrelevant. What is also not irrelevant is the question of what happens after. After the show. After the marriage. After the divorce. When the relationship ends, it ends for Barış and Elçin privately. But publicly, it never fully ends. The fan community still exists. The show is still being watched by new audiences every year. New people are falling in love with the characters, and by extension with the idea of the real relationship, every single day. For both Barış and Elçin, the most significant romantic relationship of their public lives is permanently preserved in a piece of work that will exist forever and will continue to introduce new audiences to a version of them that no longer exists in real life. That is a specific kind of strange. And both of them have had to find a way to live alongside it. There are small pieces of evidence, gathered from interviews, from observed behaviors, from the accounts of people who know them, that suggest both Barış and Elçin have reached a kind of peace with this. That they have found a way to honor what the relationship was without being destroyed by what it is no longer. Neither of them has spoken badly about the other. Ever. In any forum. In any interview. In any moment that has ever been documented. In an industry where the end of relationships frequently produces public recrimination, that shared silence is not nothing. It is a choice that both of them have actively maintained, consistently, for years. People who know them both have suggested, carefully and without specifics, that the respect between them remains genuine. That the love they had was real even if the marriage could not hold it. That the end of the relationship was not an act of failure but an act of honesty. The recognition that two people can love each other completely and still be unable to build a life together in a sustainable way. That is a harder story to tell than the story of betrayal or incompatibility that public narratives tend to prefer. It is harder because it does not have a villain. It does not have a clean explanation. It has two people who tried, who cared, who gave each other something real, and who eventually had to acknowledge that real was not enough. In Turkish entertainment culture, which is simultaneously deeply romantic in its storytelling traditions and deeply conservative in its expectations about public behavior, that kind of nuanced ending is almost impossible to communicate without being misread. So neither of them tried to communicate it. They simply let the silence hold what words would have complicated. Now let us look at where both of them are today. Because this is not just a story about the past. Barış Arduç has continued to build one of the most genuinely respected careers in Turkish television. His project choices have been consistently interesting. He has moved away from the romantic lead category that Karalık Aşk established him in and toward work that is more complex, more morally ambiguous, more interested in the interior life of flawed men navigating impossible situations. People who have worked with him in recent productions consistently describe someone who brings an unusual level of emotional intelligence to the work. Who understands not just his own character but the emotional ecosystem of every scene he is in. Elçin Sangu has been more selective. Her output in the years since the divorce has been more carefully curated. She has said in interviews, carefully and without excessive specificity, that she has become more deliberate about what she takes on. That the work has to mean something to her personally in a way that maybe it did not always have to before. That she is less interested in the version of success that is measured by volume or visibility and more interested in the version measured by whether the work actually says something true. And then there is the recent interview. Which, as discussed, opened a door that she had kept closed for years. And which, for anyone familiar with the full arc of her story, lands very differently than it would for someone encountering her for the first time. When she talked about being caged by public projection, about losing pieces of herself inside the version of her that the audience needed, about the discipline of never contradicting the image. She was describing something that began long before the divorce. But the divorce is part of that story. The experience of having a relationship that was simultaneously private and enormously public, of having love exist partly inside a performance, of losing that love and then having to continue presenting the public version of yourself as if nothing structurally important had shifted. That experience does not leave a person unchanged. What the interview suggests, to those reading carefully between lines that Elçin laid down with extraordinary precision, is that she is no longer willing to carry the full weight of that performance. That something has shifted in her relationship to the public version of herself. That the person who emerges in the next chapter of her career may be closer to whoever she actually is and further from whoever the audience decided she was 10 years ago. Whether Barış is part of that shift in any active sense, whether there is any ongoing relationship or communication between them beyond the professional courtesy that their shared industry requires, is not something that has been publicly documented and is not something that should be speculated about beyond what is actually known. What is known is this. Both of them are still here. Both of them are still working. Both of them are producing work that is better, arguably, than anything they produced during the period when their relationship was at the height of its public glory. And both of them carry, visibly to anyone paying attention, the particular quality that comes from having loved something deeply and then had to learn how to exist in its absence. That quality does not go away. It becomes part of the texture of everything you do afterward. It shows up in the way you hold a scene. In the particular register of sadness you can access. In the understanding you bring to characters who have loved and lost. It shows up, in other words, in the work. And in that way, what Barış and Elçin had together never fully ended. It lives in every performance either of them has given since. There is a specific kind of love story that does not have a happy ending in the conventional sense, but that is not a tragedy either. The kind where two people gave each other something real and lasting even though the relationship itself could not last. Where the ending was not a failure but a recognition. Where the love was true even if the timing, the context, the impossible weight of public expectation, and the particular pressure of having fallen in love inside a performance made it ultimately unsustainable. That is the story of Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu. Not the story of two characters on a beloved television show. The story of two actual human beings who found each other, loved each other, tried to build something real together under extraordinary and unusual circumstances, and who have both come out the other side with their dignity, their respect for each other, and their art intact. That is rarer than it sounds. In an industry that chews through people and relationships with equal efficiency, the fact that both of them have emerged from this chapter as better artists and apparently decent human beings is worth something. It is worth a great deal. The photograph from 2016 still exists. Two people close together, smiling at something private, carrying the entire weight of what was coming without yet knowing it was coming. It is a beautiful photograph. It is a sad photograph. It is a photograph of two people at the exact moment they had everything, just before the everything became complicated enough to eventually let go of. Some stories do not end. They just change form. This one changed form in 2020. And both of the people at the center of it are still writing what comes next. What do you think? Let us know in the comments.